Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
This is our league, and this is your league. From the 55-yard line on CFL America Radio and the Sports History Network.
This is a league of A's and BCs. It's green and red and gold and black and blue. This is a league with 2 official languages and many unofficial languages. It's East versus West, wheat versus iron, love versus hate. This is a league where superstars are extraordinary and ordinary at the same time. It's a league of ice, of fog, of mud and wind. And for one Sunday in November, it's the nation's glue. This is a league as diverse as a country, a league of Jacksons and Kwongs, Johnsons, Moscas, O'Shea's, and Haji Razulis. This is his league, her league, their league, and their league. It's my league, and it's your league. This is our league.
Welcome to From the 55-Yard Line with Greg James and Scott Adamson. And we are here today with Paul Woods, noted a former journalist with the Canadian Press, an editor at the Toronto Star, and the author of a great book called Bouncing Back about the 1983 Argos, and a new book coming out entitled Year of the Rocket. Paul, welcome.
Thank you very much, Greg. Nice to be here with you guys.
Hi, Paul.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for coming on. I know it's Saturday and it is very hot out in South Carolina and Chicago and Toronto. So it's probably the best time we could have picked to do this interview inside of air conditioning and with all of us. So, so let's get rolling. And first question I have is, in terms of the Toronto Argonauts. Now, Toronto is the biggest city in Canada.
Yep.
And if you could just kind of lay out for us just kind of a quick thumbnail history of the Argos for the uneducated Americans down here when it comes to Canadian football. Pretty much why the Argos, who are the Argos and really why are they so important in professional football?
Sure. Well, yeah, it's a really interesting story. They're coming up on 150 years old. I mean, they began play in 1873. The United States at that point wasn't quite 100 years old. Canada at that point was 6 years old. Canada founded in 1867. So 6 years later, the Argonauts started playing football, and it was sprung out of a much bigger sport back in the 1860s and 70s, rowing. The rowing was a big endeavor, and there was a thing called the Argonaut Rowing Club in Toronto. And what they did, guys that were in the rowing club decided they wanted to start playing the thing called rugby football, as another way of getting exercise and having fun and stuff. And so the Argonauts Football Club was formed as part of the rowing club. And then, of course, in those days, there's pretty small schedules. There was even though they've been around since 1873, so you can argue that next year, 150th year, they didn't play every single year. There's a few years in the late 1800s where there were no games played under the name Toronto Argonauts, but for the most part, they've been playing ever since 1873. Of course, fans down there may not know that our huge rivals are the Hamilton Tiger Cats. Hamilton is about a depending on traffic, it's 45 minutes to an hour outside of Toronto, smaller city nearby. And Tiger Cats fans hate Argo fans and hate the Argos. Argo fans sort of don't care about the Tiger Cats too much, but the Tiger Cats try to claim that they're older because we're playing. There was a team called the Hamilton Tigers that was playing in 1869, so 4 years before the Argonauts. But the Tigers merged with the Wildcats in 1950. So the Hamilton Tiger Cats, as we know them, have only been around since 1950. But football was played in Hamilton 4 years before it was played in Toronto. So the Argos played starting in 1873. When what mutated and evolved into Canadian football got going in the late 1800s and in the early part of the 20th century. The Argos, contested the Grey Cup very early on. The Grey Cup's been awarded since 1909, and so the Argos were not the first winner, but they were among the early winners, and they've won more Grey Cups than any other franchise. They won 17. They were under the Argonauts Rowing Club banner up until I believe it was 1958, 57 or 58. It was sold to private interests. Business consortium led by a guy who was a bigwig in Toronto back then, a guy named John Bassett Sr. Some of your viewers will have heard of John Bassett Jr. He was involved with the USFL, with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Tampa Bay.
He was with the Bandits in the
Tampa
USFL.
Bay Bandits. That's right.
But
yeah,
he also owned the Birmingham Bull.
That's right. That's right. He did.
I remember him well.
That's absolutely right. In fact, and arguably, just to digress for a second, the Birmingham Bulls were arguably the reason that hockey players started playing professional hockey before the age of 20. They weren't allowed in the NHL before the age of 20, and John Bassett Jr. signed a bunch of kids junior hockey to play for his Bulls. They called them the Baby Bulls, and that led to a change in the rules so that you could now draft guys when they were 18 years old and bring them up and so on. But that's a whole side story. So Bassett Sr. bought the Argos, basically led a consortium, and then eventually got majority control of the Argonauts in the late 50s. He owned the team until I believe it was 74. When they were bought by a guy named Bill Hodgson, who was a hotel owner. 4 years later, the team was sold to Carling O'Keefe, which at the time was Canada's third largest brewing company. Carling O'Keefe owned them for 10 years. Then they went for 2 years to a guy named Harry Ornest, a character named Harry Ornest, who features a little bit. He's got a chapter in my upcoming book. He's an interesting guy. He owned the Argos for 89 and 90. They moved into the Sky Dome in 1989. They had played most of their life. They had played in a stadium called Varsity Stadium, which was part of the University of Toronto. In the downtown core of Toronto. In 58, they moved into Exhibition Stadium on the grounds of Canadian National Exhibition. They were there for 30 years. Then they moved into Sky Dome in 89. Sky Dome was built, Sky Dome being the first retractable roof stadium, I think in the world, was built because there was a Grey Cup game played in Toronto in 1982 that just pissed rain. It was an unbelievable downpour, and half of Exhibition Stadium had no roof on it. The one side, the south stands, were uncovered, and the people over there were just flooded. And that led the politicians to say we need a dome stadium. Of course, the Blue Jays had come along in '77 and joined, and they were also playing in Exhibition Stadium, which got bastardized to allow baseball in there. It turned the stadium into kind of a crappy environment for football and baseball. But having the Blue Jays there and the Argos and that rainy Grey Cup led to the building of Sky Dome. So that happens in '89. They were there for about 27 years, I guess. And then in 2016, they moved into BMO Field, where they are now, which is pretty close to where old Exhibition Stadium was. BMO Field is a fantastic place to watch football. It's outdoors, it's real grass. They don't even put ads on the field because it's shared with the TFC soccer team. Fantastic viewing experience, great sightlines. In the interim between Harry Ornest and now, they've had a number of owners. Harry sold it to the most famous owners in the history of the team, which was John Candy, Wayne Gretzky, and Bruce McNall. Bought the team in '91. They signed Rocket Ismail from Notre Dame, who was going to be the #1 pick in the NFL draft. Gave him more money the football player in any league had ever been paid. They owned the team for 3 years. That's the subject of my book, and we can talk about that at some point. And then the ownership has changed hands 4 or 5 times since then. What's interesting, and maybe to wrap up my long-winded, you wanted me to give you the quick version. I'm giving you the long-winded version, but
no, that's okay. It's great.
So to wrap this up, they've gone from being a very prominent place in Toronto and in Canadian sports. I mean, if you go back to the late 60s, early 70s, when the Argos were arguably at their peak in popularity, they were up there. They were probably bigger than the Toronto Maple Leafs are. And of course, Canada is a hockey country, but in Toronto, the Argos were as big as the Leafs back then. Leo Cahill ran the team. They had a lot of renegades on the team back then. They almost won the Grey Cup in '71, didn't. And then they would sell out exhibition stadium. It was 33,000 seats, and they were sold out for 3 or 4 years in a row. And then it expanded to 54,000 seats when the Blue Jays came, and they didn't quite sell out, but they averaged 47,000 fans a game back in the late 70s. And then it's been a slow and steady slide ever since. Sadly for the hardcore fans like me, we've seen the team have some fantastic success since 1982. But we've also seen their place in the marketplace has just continually gone down. They're now number 4 in the market here at best, behind the Leafs, the Blue Jays. Actually, they're arguably number 5, and they may be behind the soccer team TFC, although they way better TV ratings than soccer does, but TFC outdraws them in the building. Obviously, you've got the Leafs, the Blue Jays, the Raptors. Raptors are huge. Then you've got TFC and the Argos kind of in that lower tier. But Toronto's also become an NFL city. There were years of games being blacked out, local home games being blacked out, and a lot of fans at the same Canada got cable before anybody else. Southern Ontario got cable sooner than anybody else in North America, basically. And so we were getting NFL games beamed into here, and Argo games were being played at the same times and were blacked out. And so people would start watching NFL games. So we've seen this steady decline of the Argos in the marketplace, to the point now where they averaged, I think, 12 or 14,000 fans in the last time we played in 2019. The ratings are good. The CFL draws great ratings, and they draw great ratings in the Toronto market. Argo games draw well. There was an old joke that the Argos are like porn. Everybody watches and nobody admits to it. You watch it quietly in the privacy of your own home, right? But so they're struggling, and that's one of the reasons why I believe that the owners of the Argonauts, which is MLSE, which also owns the Leafs and the Raptors and TFC, I think they're pushing hard for a merger with the XFL, because they see the CFL with its 9 teams, while every other league has gone to 30 plus teams. They don't see it. They don't see growth potential here. They don't see a chance to build the value of the enterprise. And I think they see that as being possible with an XFL merger. We don't have to talk about the XFL, or we can, whatever you'd like, but that's where they are. They're in a rough spot in the market right now. Got really diehard fans, but there aren't enough of us coming to games. There's maybe 10 or 12,000 real hardcore Argo fans who are there no matter what, love the double blue, love the boatman, love all that stuff. But in the greater Toronto area, which is, as you said, it's the biggest city in Canada and maybe the 3rd biggest city in North America, when you look at the suburbs, they're an afterthought. A lot of people don't know what the Argos are. They would never think of going to a game. They don't even know they exist. So there you go.
That's amazing to me. Just considering the history of it, though, to have it drop off like it has, it's almost like the way you're describing it, that fans have sort of aged out of the Argos or something. It's like maybe
that's it's sort of right to a certain extent, Scott. I mean, there's a million factors for what happened, and I've often said that I hope the Argos never go out of business. Obviously, I really fervently want that. I love the team, and I want them to be around for as long as I exist. But I never did go out of business. There's a hell of a book to be written about how they went from way up here to down here. And there's a million reasons. I mean, the Blue Jays is one of them. The NFL thing I talked about is one of them. The Raptors is one of them. There's the fact that, when we talk about the Blue Jays arrived in '77, and suddenly the New York Yankees and the Boston Red Sox come into town. And then next week, the Saskatchewan Roughriders are coming to play the Argos. It just doesn't. Toronto longs to be a world-class city. Torontonians, they don't identify with Canada the way they should. They sort of have this southern viewpoint, and they see themselves as in the league of the New Yorks and the Los Angeleses of the world. And so the Yankees is a cooler sounding thing than the Saskatchewan Roughriders. There's so many factors. And one thing is they went 31 years without winning the Grey Cup. From 52 to 83, they never won. And in a 19 league, it's pretty hard not to win any of them in 31 years. And so there was this huge demand to win, like the pent up demand for it. And when it finally happened in 83, it was right around the time the Blue Jays were getting good and competitive. And it's like, okay, finally, we won. Now we can move on to other stuff. We can start going to baseball games instead. And then, of course, they didn't market themselves. They marketed themselves terribly back then. They did not perceive the Blue Jays as a competitive threat. The Blue Jays were an unbelievable competitive threat. They were marketing to young families and kids and cheap tickets and a fun afternoon at the ballpark. And the Argos thought that you just had to basically say tickets are on sale and people buy tickets, or put on a winning team and people will show up. It doesn't work that way in this market, as it turned out. It would for hockey. The Leafs can sell out no matter no matter how terrible they are. But in the case of the Argos and football, they got good and their attendance went down. And that pattern has been repeated. I mean, their attendance went down in 84 after winning the Grey Cup in 83. It went down in 92 after winning the Grey Cup in 91. When they had Doug Flutie here in 96 and 97, the greatest CFL team ever, probably, or certainly one of the top 3 CFL teams of all time. 2 years in a row, they went 17-3 and won the championship. They got 17,000 fans a game in a 54,000 seat stadium. So this market has turned its back on football. When they moved into BMO, like a lot of other people, I believe that was going to be a real salvation, getting back to outdoor football on grass in a great venue. But I said it's going to take 3 to 5 years of building the brand back after 30 to 35 years of neglect and abuse by bad ownership groups. Not all of them, but some of them were pretty bad. But after doing it for now 4 years, it's not a 3 to 5 year proposition. It's maybe a 10-year proposition. And I don't know that MLSE has the patience to do this for 10 years. That's what I think they're pushing for merger with the XFL. They haven't said that. That's just a conjecture, and it's what I believe, though.
In terms of just like marketing, how are they marketed up there? I mean, to me, marketing starts with just even coverage on local news. Is the local news talking about the Argos, or are they pretty much just an afterthought even in the newscast?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a decline over the years. I mean, in the old days, like in the early 80s, when I moved to Toronto in 1980, there was an Argo story on the local newscasts every night at 6 o'clock and 11 o'clock. Not every night, but very often, right?
Right.
And of course, there were 3 newspapers in Toronto back in the 80s, and they all had Argo beat reporters, and they all had columnists who covered the Argos regularly, went regularly to Argo games, sometimes went on the road with the team. But over time, the coverage just dissipated. I mean, the local TV news doesn't really have reporters anymore. There was a half-hour sports program every night at 11:30 before like Sports Center came along and all those kinds of national ventures. There was one in Ontario for Global TV, and they ran a lot of sports coverage, but they only had 2 full-time reporters. So given day, one of them might be at an Argo practice and one of them might be doing something about the Leafs or the Blue Jays or horse racing or whatever. But you could still count on getting some Argo coverage 2 or 3 times a week. But that show's been off the air for years. Like some of the local stations don't really cover sports anymore. The local TV, the local newspapers, only one. There's now 4 papers in town, but only one of them has anybody on the Argo beat. The Toronto Sun actually does cover sports pretty aggressively. The other ones have left it to the wires mostly, and they focus their coverage on the Leafs, Raptors, and Blue Jays. And they've even the Toronto Sun, which for many years was the best sports section probably America, it's been shrunk. It's now down to 12 pages a day. It used to be 24 to 36 pages every day. Now it's 12. So they don't often squeeze. Sometimes they don't squeeze an Argo story in, even if there's one to tell. So it's a challenge.
Right. And so it sounds to me like this has just been a gradual decline since, let's start with the 80s, since they won that championship.
Yeah. I mean, their high water mark for attendance was I believe 78, I think. So 77 to 79, their attendance was in the high 40,000s. Then it started to shrink a little bit. It blipped back up in 82 when the team finally got good after a decade of being terrible. They got good and they got entertaining. So there were a couple of games with 50,000 plus at the stadium that year. Then the next year they won the Grey Cup, and they still had great attendance by today's standards, but it started going down. And like I said, they won the Grey Cup in 83. The attendance dropped the following year. And it's been basically at this kind of a hockey stick ever since. The odd blip up, 91, when McNall, Gretzky, and Candy came in and they signed the Rocket, and they had what I think was the greatest year in team history. Not necessarily the greatest Argo team, but the greatest year in the history of the franchise. Attendance went up, and they had 50,000 fans at the playoff game that led to them playing in the Grey Cup the following week. Attendance went down the next year. They raised ticket prices. They stopped marketing. They did a bunch of stupid things. And so it's been and some years the owners were terrible. They've had a few owners that were very poor, that didn't spend a dime on marketing or did it really badly. So they've struggled. I mean,
right.
I don't think an Argonaut franchise has made a profit probably since, I don't know, 79, maybe.
See, it's just mind-boggling to me, especially the way the world works now with social media, that marketing is not job one. If that should be the one thing that you have.
But Scott, the trouble is the new ownership, the MLSC and their predecessors, they were owned by 2/3 of MLSC up until 2 years ago, and then the other third came on board. So they've really had the same ownership for the last 4 to 5 years, and all that time in the new stadium, and they've done some really good things. They tried to tailgate parties, which of course are huge in the States, but have never been a tradition in Canada. We've got tighter liquor laws and things like that, but they tried that, and they tried really cool TV commercials. The Argos have a fantastic presence on social media. They're probably the best social media team in the Canadian Football League, and it's not like they haven't spent money. They've tweaked ticket pricing, and they've tried a bunch of different things. And it just seems like whatever they try, they're struggling to get traction in this market. Part of it is the market itself. It's a huge city, and it's so huge that it's hard to get around, right? I can get to a game because I can hop on a commuter train and be dropped off right at the door of the stadium. But if I had to drive to a game, it's a nightmare. Traffic's as bad as LA or worse. And the location where they are is the only one that you can get to from every direction, either by car or by public transit. So they need to be where they are. A lot of people often say, if they just the suburbs, everything would be solved. No, it wouldn't, because the suburbs is not one thing. The suburbs is 10 different things. And there are suburbs of Toronto that are way farther from me than the Argos are right now. No way I would ever drive to Oshawa to a game. And I couldn't take the train. It would I could take, if I want to spend 2.5 hours. They've got challenges like that, and it's multicultural. Canada's a very multicultural country. Thankfully, I'm glad of that. And Toronto's an incredibly multicultural city. But for people that have come here from other lands, whether it's first or later generations, gridiron football is not a big thing overseas. And so, you follow soccer, basketball's got a glowing global presence. And if you really want to fit into Canada and into Toronto, you got to follow hockey, right? And so football, and then of course the NFL is this global behemoth that's right next door. We get a ton of games broadcast in Canada every week, more than you probably get in almost any city in the United States. And so you add that all up, and it's like everything you try, none of it seems to be working.
Have they tried? And I don't recall hearing this, but they tried what they tried in Edmonton, which seemed to work, at least on camera, was cheap beer.
Oh yeah. They when they did the tailgate thing in the first couple seasons, I forget. I think you could get a beer at of course, it's not an American tailgate tradition. You wasn't bring you. I think there was one part of it where you actually could drive your own vehicle, and I think you could bring your own beer, but I'm not sure. You may have had to buy their beer, but it was cheap. And then even when they sort of bail out of the tailgating thing, although tailgating does happen in a very small way, kind of illegal and on its own, and nobody's interfering with them, and that's good. I'd like that to grow kind of organically. But they did say these things were like, you can go walk into the stadium an hour and a half or 2 hours before the game and you can get really cheap beer. You can get a beer for $3 or $4, which, I mean, it's more expensive than buying it at a beer store, but it's way cheaper than buying it at any restaurant, right?
And I've noticed just in the social media and looking at all the teams and trying to how they're promote, the one thing, like you said, is Toronto does have really the best in terms of social media. Now, I think the Elks are going to, the rebranded team is going to be kind of neck and neck, but Toronto has always had a very good social media presence, even when they've been losing enough not to take themselves too seriously. And
absolutely, they have a lot of fun on there, and they poke fun at themselves as well as everybody else, right?
Yeah. But so Pinball Clemens came back, and what has his effect been on maybe turning this thing around? He seems to be the point man to turn this thing around, at least the face that's out front for the team. And he is a legend. I mean, if you could explain even for people down here in the States who Pinball Clemens is, because I know a lot of people down here, 99% of football fans down here wouldn't know who Pinball Clemens is.
Yeah, he's the greatest Argonaut of all time. Maybe he's the most legendary Argonaut of all time, and arguably the most legendary Canadian football player of all time. He's not Canadian; he's American. He's from Florida. He came up in 1989. A little guy, 5'5", running back. Set the league on fire in his second year. Set a record for the most all-purpose yards, 3,300 all-purpose yards. He was catching the ball. He was running out of the backfield. He was returning punts, returning kickoffs. Won the most outstanding player award in 1990, despite being the smallest guy in the league. And he played for the Argos for 12 years. And he broke that all-purpose yardage record later. When he played with Doug Flutie, he went for like 3,800 yards one year. And
he's always been an Argonaut.
Argonaut, yeah. He did play. He actually played 8 games in the NFL with the Kansas City Chiefs. He was drafted by Kansas City in '87. Played 8 games as a kick returner. Got cut by the Chiefs. Had a tryout with the Tampa Bay Bucks. Where of course he's from Dunedin, so that's nearby. And they told him, we're going with somebody younger. The guy was 23 years old, which is a bit ridiculous. So, and he got his rights belonged to the Calgary Stampeders. And they ran into because the league, the CFL has this thing where teams can place players on a negotiation list. If nobody else has got the player on their list, they can place this player on their list, and then they have exclusive to negotiate with them and offer them a contract for Canadian football. Calgary had put him on their list. They offered him a contract. He was going to come up to camp in '89. And the Stampeders ran into an injury problem at quarterback, and they had to suddenly sign another quarterback, and they had to drop somebody off the roster. They dropped Pinball. Well, he wasn't named Pinball. It was Mike Clemens at the time, and he went to William and Mary University, and Ralph Sazio, who was the Argos president at the time, was also an alumnus of William and Mary, and he knew a little bit about Michael Clemens, and so he grabbed him, he snapped him off Calgary's negotiation list and offered him a contract, said come on up on the next flight. So he got up and he blew everybody away by bouncing off tacklers. The coach at the time, Bob Obilovich, said the guy bounces around it like a pinball out there, and that became his nickname, and it's stuck ever since. So he played for 12 years, and then in 2000 was arguably one of the worst seasons the Argos were ever having. They had an absolutely atrocious coach and general manager that year, and under a new owner. And 8 games into the season, they fired the coach, and it suddenly made Pinball the head coach. He was an active player at the time. He ended up playing, I think, 1 or 2 games while he was the head coach. There was this game called Pinball's Last Run, where this is going to be the last time he ever suits up for the Argos. But he was also the head coach at the time, and then he coached the team for the next few years. Won the Grey Cup as a coach. He had 3 Grey Cup rings as a player. Won the Grey Cup as a head coach, the first Black head coach to win the Grey Cup in Canadian football. and then he moved up into the front office, into sort of like president and vice president, various roles that kind of left him, I think, I hate to say it, kind of a bit of a figurehead. Like, he wasn't really actively involved in the organization. He's got a lot of other things on the go. He's an incredible motivational speaker. If you ever get to hear him speak, you will not believe it. He will blow your mind how inspiring he is. And if you ever meet the man, you will believe after 2 seconds that he's known you all his life. He makes friends with everybody, and he means it. Like, there's no act. This is pinball. But they sort of pushed him off to the side, and like, he became sort of like a figurehead president or vice president, but he wasn't really doing too much from what I could see. And then a couple of years ago, Bill Manning, who's the president of the Argos and Toronto FC, realized, like, I got this incredible asset sitting around in this organization. We're not taking full advantage of him. And he made him general manager. And it's like, I think as a general manager, he's doing an amazing job, because he's recruited a whole pile of amazing players for this team. We're hoping we can get on the field this year. I'm dying to see this Argonauts team with the talent we've got, and a lot of those guys, because pinball is the most persuasive man on earth. But and he's for sure, if you were to go around Toronto, people that don't know anything about the Argos, a lot of them know Pinball Clements. They've often said he could run for mayor, he could run for prime minister. But even that isn't enough on its own to sell this team. They've got to find ways to get people into the building. They've got to expose them to the product. The product's got to be exciting. The product's got to be entertaining. People have got to leave and have a lot of fun and say, I'm going back. Ticket pricing's got to be right. So hopefully, if he gets a chance to build the roster the way it looks like he's building it, we can become successful on the field. And then whether or not we merge with the XFL, or whether the MLS ends up staying at the 9-team CFL, hopefully MLSE stays with it to the point where they're willing to sort of do the years of work and grassroots building that will bring this back. I mean, you can break even or make money in this league if you get 22,000 fans a game. So it's not that hard to do in theory. This market, it's proven to be pretty hard.
Did you get a chance to talk to Pinball for your book?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. He was a big part of the 91 team, and he was incredibly insightful. And, he's a big part of that story. 90 was his most outstanding player year. So the year before. And in fact, it's funny that, 91 is the everybody remembers because of Rocket and Candy and Gretzky and McNall, and the unbelievable story of the Grey Cup that year, the most courageous performance by any player in Canadian football history, with the quarterback Matt Dunnigan playing with a broken collarbone and leading the team to victory on the coldest Grey Cup of all time. You add it all up, it's an unbelievable story. The year before, though, when Pinball was most outstanding player in the league, the Argos had the best offense the league's ever seen. That 1990 Argonaut offense was a juggernaut. And they put up 70 points in a game, 68 points, 59 points. They won games with their fifth string quarterback. They were so friggin' good that year. And then the next year they had Rocket Ismail. It's like, who's going to stop it? Well, they ended up, they won more games. They didn't accumulate quite as many points. They still had an amazing offense. Pinball was hurt for a good part of the 91 season, but was still a big part of it. And he was actually in the 91 Grey Cup. He played a very important role that people maybe not realize. He was basically a very important decoy. He was playing with an unbelievably painful injury, a turf toe injury that in fact it was sore all through the 92 season. His foot was killing him for more than a year, but he played that 91 Grey Cup game, and because he's Pinball, Calgary had to put their best defensive back on him all day long, and so he just basically took Daryl Hall out of the play for the whole game, and the Argos won the Grey Cup without needing many touches from Pinball that day. So yeah, I did talk to him, and he was his usual unbelievable insights and articulate and fun to talk to. He's got some good stories in the book for sure. And
in terms of just now, did you speak to him before he took over, before he became GM, or after?
Just before, actually.
Okay.
It was, I was astounded about a month later when they suddenly announced Pinball's becoming the GM. I'm sure he was in discussions at that stage.
Right.
He obviously didn't let on to me, right? But
did he give you any thoughts in terms of what he thought the team needed to do to improve its standing?
Yeah, we
in
did.
Toronto?
We didn't really talk about that stuff, Greg. I was really focused on what was happening back in 91 to 93,
yeah.
right? So it's, and Pinball, he's an incredibly busy man and incredibly hard to get. In fact, the day I interviewed him, we had to like delay the interview by 5 hours because he just got tied up with something. And so I said, like, I got an hour. I got to use this time very effectively. So we talked about all the stories that he could tell me about 91, 92, 93. We haven't sat down and ever had that discussion about what the team can do to sort of improve in the marketplace. But I'm sure he's had those discussions with Bill Manning and others, and having pinball as the focal point and the front man, it certainly can't hurt. You can't not love Pinball Clemens.
This is bouncing around a little bit back to your first book, but
Sure.
Two things that I really like to get your take on. Condredge Holloway is, he prepped in Alabama, so I knew who he was before he went to Tennessee.
Yep.
And then also the Mouse Davis offense, just kind of, reimagining things when he got to Canada. I just sort of like to get your takes on both of those, because those are, the man and the offense are both very interesting to me.
Well, thanks, Scott. Condredge Holloway is, for many Argo fans, he's still their favorite player. Like, you ask a lot of people, who's your favorite Argo or who's your favorite quarterback? Sure, some will say Doug Flutie and some will say Ricky Ray and some will say Pinball Clemens, but a lot of people say Condredge Holloway. And he, Condredge, I loved that guy. He came. So I got to Toronto in '80, and they had a not what looked like incoming team, but they didn't have a good quarterback. And then the head coach, Willie Wood, the great Green Bay Packer legend, was the head coach, and he knew we needed a quarterback, and he got Condredge Holloway from the Ottawa Rough Riders in a trade. And you just couldn't help but love Condredge. He was such a competitor and a little guy, but an unbelievable arm and brave and just willing to put his head down and get hammered. And they suffered through the worst year in team history. There were 2 wins and 14 losses in '81. And the first 3 games that year, they lost by a combined total of 5 points. 1 point, 1 point, and 3 points. And they could and should have won all 3 of those games. And I think it was the third game of that 3, home game. And they're down. They're marching for the winning touchdown to get off the Schneid, and Condredge throws a ball. It just sailed a little bit, and it got picked off at the goal line. And he was so mad, he took his helmet off and he threw it onto the ground, and it busted into pieces on the hard artificial turf at Exhibition Stadium. And then later he apologized, like, kids shouldn't see a guy do that, like you just couldn't help but love the guy. And then of course the next year, so then they unfortunately fired Willie Wood. I loved Willie as a coach, but they were 0-10. He got fired by the 10th game of that season. And the next year they brought in Bob Bilovich, and Bob Bilovich hired Mouse Davis as the offensive coordinator. And Mouse came up from U.S. college ball and brought this thing called the run and shoot. And it took advantage of a lot of stuff that happens in Canadian football, like unlimited motion in the backfield. And he designed it was basically, it was a system that was designed kind of to get your quarterbacks killed, because a lot of the times the offensive linemen were peeling up to go and block for receivers downfield. And so like Condredge Holloway would have to take like either a 5-step or a 7-step drop and get rid of that baller, because he is going to get pounded. And man, when it took about, I think it was the 5th game of the '82 season before that offense actually worked. And when it did, holy crap, we'd never seen anything like it, especially Argo fans, because we'd suffered for years, right? I mean, they didn't win between 52 and 83. I was a fan since about 68. So I said from 68 to 81, I only knew failure and mostly misery. Although there were some entertaining Argo teams right at the turn of the 60s and into the early 70s, but they didn't win. They didn't win at all. They got to the Grey Cup once, but from 71 until 81, it was mostly just garbage, and they would find creative ways to lose. Right there, like there was one year they go into the last game of the season. You can get in the playoffs if you just lose the game by 15 points and they lose by 16, right? Like that kind of stuff would happen. And it was always to Hamilton, the rivals down the road, right? And so when suddenly now we get to game week, I think it was week 5, I think, of the '82 season, home game against the Edmonton Eskimos. And Edmonton at that point was about to win their 5th Grey Cup in a row. They were the dynasty of all time. And Warren Moon was the quarterback, and man, they were and every year they would come to Toronto and just decimate the Argos. And that night, we kicked them. We kicked the crap out of them, and it was Condredge Holloway to Terry Greer, unbelievable long bomb touchdowns, and exhibition stadium went bananas. The place was so crazy. Thousands of fans stormed the field after the game. Like it was the two players of the game, Holloway and Rick Moore, on the defensive star of the game, were being interviewed by TV, and they like Rick Moore had to basically pound guys out of the way to get Condredge to the locker room afterwards, because there were fans on there trying to like, give me your glove, give me, and Condredge had an unbelievable year in '82. That offense was just made for him, and so he was the most outstanding player of the league that year. And then most left after 1 year. There was basically a power struggle. I think he wanted more power than old Bilovich was willing to give him. Maybe he wanted to be a head coach, I don't know, but he went down to the USFL. And everybody thought, well, there goes the run and shoot. But the guys knew, and in fact, there's a funny story in my book about '83, the bouncing back book. They brought in an assistant coach, obviously a new offensive coordinator came in to replace Mouse, and he didn't understand the run and shoot. And the players, led by Condredge, just said, like, fuck this, we're doing the run, we're running the run and shoot anyway, boys. And they did, and they won the Grey Cup with it. And the guys wanted to buy Mouse Davis a Grey Cup ring. They did good, but he's mad. He wishes he got one, right? But that run and shoot offense, and of course now, even that season, even during the '82 season, teams were copying it. It's funny, there was this one bread and butter play of the run and shoot, which they called the hitch screen pass. It would basically, Holloway would take the snap and would instantly throw a pass out to the one side, usually to Terry Greer, the best receiver in the league at the time. And he would catch it basically like maybe 1 yard over the line of scrimmage. And then he would start peeling upfield, and you'd have these two offensive guards up running with him, right? And mowing down defenders as he's running. And in the Grey Cup in '82, the year the run and shoot came up, they Argos did a crazy thing. They put in a receiver for the first time in the Grey Cup game, a guy named Emmanuel Tolbert. They plucked him off Saskatchewan's practice roster, and he was better in their view than the guy they had starting all year. So they put him in the lineup for the for the Grey Cup, and they threw him on the other side a hitch screen pass, and he went for like an 84-yard touchdown. And later in that same game, Edmonton threw the hitch screen pass to Waddell Smith, and he ran for a touchdown. Like, teams were stealing the offense from Mouse as it was going on. And you watch, even now I see hitch screen passes all the time. It's like that became one of the predominant pass plays in Canadian football. A short pass to the sideline to a guy who's only 1 or 2 steps over the line, and you got blockers in front. It's the bread and butter play, and Mouse brought it to the league. He brought a lot of innovative plays to the league. The motion, you don't see as much motion now. What you see with the thing that's called the waggle, right, where the inside receivers don't have to be lined up on the end, can move in motion towards the line of scrimmage before the snap. But what Mouse had he had the guys crisscrossing in the backfield. So you'd have like a slot back and a fullback and a slot back and a fullback all crisscrossing before the ball snapped. So you could obviously, Condredge could see, well, are they in man coverage or are they in zone? If anybody's moving, then they're in man. And depending on how there's lined up in a zone, I know this guy's going to have a mismatch. That's what it was. And Mouse's offense was predicated, and every team does this now. Every team in sport, in football, does this. It was predicated on read and react. So it was up to Condredge, Holloway, and Terry Greer and the other receivers to see how the guys were lined up in the coverage and run their patterns accordingly. Greer would see where a guy was lined up, and he would know that means I'm going to run an out or an in or a slant or a go. And he and Condredge had to get on the same wavelength on that. And it took 4 games. The first 4 games, they were struggling. But when they got it in that game 5, it was like, one of the guys in my book described it was like you could see a telepathic ray between Holloway and Greer. They both knew exactly what he was going to do. And Holloway threw the ball knowing Terry's going to be there. And Greer ran there because he saw how the defensive backs were lined up in coverage. That's where Condredge is going to throw the ball. And everybody does that now, right? Those kind of timing and read patterns are just constant in the NFL, college football, Canadian football. Everybody's doing it. It's all because of Mouse Davis, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, he had to be like a kid in a candy store when he got there with all the rule innovations in Canada that just, made his style absolutely perfect.
Oh yeah, the motion and the extra guy, like he's got an extra weapon, right? He's got 6 receivers instead of 5. So yeah, you add all that up, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's sort of. I remember when they had the American experiment, they were billing it as longer, wider, faster, and it definitely when you had Condridge and working out of a Mouse Davis offense.
Yeah, if Canadian football done properly is incredibly entertaining and arguably more entertaining than any other brand of football. And unfortunately, and this I think is one of the things that hasn't helped the Argos, although it's not only affecting them, but I think the rules and the way teams have coached in the last 15 to 20 years have changed, have lost some of the entertainment value. It's not as fast a game. I watch old games. I got a lot of games originally on tape, and now they're all digitized. And if you watch them, you watch a play, the play comes to a halt, the whistle blows, and you use a 30-second skip feature that a lot of VCRs and DVD recorders have. You just jump 30 seconds ahead. The next play is already underway. Nowadays, it doesn't happen. Nowadays, everybody's making all these substitutions. The roster's got bigger. So now 3 new defensive linemen are coming on the field and 2 new receivers are coming on the field. And the referee's watching all this. And then finally starts the 20-second clock. And so by the time the ball is snapped, 30 or 35 or 40 seconds have elapsed, whereas there used to be 2 plays done in the time it's now taken 1. So we've lost some of that. And, and I think the teams have loaded up on defense. They've loaded up all these coaches, they now got 12 coaches on every staff, and most of them are trying to stop you from scoring. They're not trying to score. They're not bringing in Mouse Davises. They're bringing in Buddy Ryans, guys that are just designed to kill offense. And so Canadian football, and in the meanwhile, the U.S. has been stealing all of our innovations, right? The U.S. NFL stole some of these things, like the hitch screen pass and things like that. They now run 5 receiver sets. It used to be that you never see 5 receiver sets in the NFL. You'd see 2, a fullback and a running back and a tight end and 2 wideouts. Now you see 5 guys, and sometimes they're even 5 fast, young, small guys. We were doing that 30 years ago, right? So and they stealing all our best quarterbacks. Condridge Holloway, if he had been born 30 years later, he would have been playing in the NFL. Like he was that good. The NFL didn't want black guys. They didn't want 5'10" guys playing quarterback back then. But now they're quite happy to have guys like Russell Wilson and players of that caliber who 30 years ago would have all been coming to Canada. So I'm glad for society that the NFL is not as racist as it used to be, but it's hurt Canadian football to be blunt, right?
Well, I know Greg and I have talked about, we love, from the standpoint of rules, we like the CFL much better than, American college or NFL. But yeah, for me, there's nothing more frustrating than to see a CFL game that ends up, 14-12 or something. I mean, you want points. If I'm watching a CFL game, I want to see points.
Well, funny, Scott, I wrote writing about 90 and 91 primarily in this new book I've got coming out, and 90 in my view was the apex of Canadian football entertainment. I mean, the Argos scored more points than any team had ever scored that year, and there were tons of games that were like 51-42 and 39-36. There was just tons and tons of scoring. And some people say, I like defensive football too. I like defensive football too, but I want to see big plays and excitement. And there was a ton of excitement back then. And I think some of that has been bled out of the game. And if they do end up going ahead with a merger, and who knows if it'll happen, I know most Canadian football fans don't seem to want it. I do. I think what they got to do is they got to make sure that the rules are incredibly entertaining and incredibly exciting. They got to make it so that it's really, really entertaining to attract casual fans and young kids and things like that. And you could take a lot of Canadian rules and do that. I mean, certainly you take even if it's 11-man football and 4 downs, unlimited motion in the backfield that to me like a no-brainer. You got to do that. Some of the kicking game rules, the single point, the rouge. Some people say it's a reward for failure, but I'd like to tweak the rule a little bit to make it so it's not a reward for failure. But I like the fact that if a team misses a field goal, it might come out of the end zone. They might run it back. Right. You don't get that, and like run backs are exciting plays. So to me, you want to encourage teams to actually field the ball and run it back. So you bring in some of those rules, and maybe you bring in some new rules. I'd like hey, we've got a theoretical 20-second clock, but as I said, in reality, it's more like a 35-second clock. I'd make it a 20 or maybe a 25-second clock, but make it like the NFL's 40. As soon as the whistle blows, the clock starts. So, okay, play's dead. You now got 25 seconds to do all your substitutions and get the ball snapped again. Force teams to get the ball and play quicker. It'll mean you'll get fewer substitutions. You'll get more guys that are tired, which leads to mistakes, which leads to big plays. Right. So they do stuff like that. And you can make, I do believe Canadian football is inherently more entertaining, but they've got to take advantage of some of the things that they've sort of stopped taking advantage of.
So in talking about CFL being, I'm sorry, Scott,
no,
but in terms
of
Iowa, and Scott and I have had this conversation in terms of the brands of football we find most entertaining. And for us, it's always been the CFL brand. And in talking about the 91 team, let's talk about entertainment in general. John Candy. Tell me about him. I mean, I know in the title of your new book, he is part of the title of your new book. And in terms of owners, I mean, how much more entertaining can you have than somebody with like John Candy?
Yeah, he's a huge part of the story. He's really, in some ways, he's like the hero of the book, because, the Argos have been around for almost 150 years, and they've had a lot of owners over that time. They've only had one owner of all that time who just genuinely loved the Argonauts, and that was John Candy. He grew up in Toronto. He wanted to play for the Argos as a kid. He always says if he didn't have his knee injuries in high school, he would have played for the Argos. Who knows if that's true, but he thought it was, and he loved the team. He went on the road with that team every game that year. And when John Candy came to town, the whole town went crazy, right? He was the biggest star that Canada's ever produced, arguably, certainly in Hollywood terms. In terms of, acting, he's the biggest star forever. And then you had Wayne Gretzky, the greatest hockey player of all time. And you had Bruce McNall, who, turned out to be a real fraud artist, but he was also the owner of the Los Angeles Kings and a guy who seemed to be like a tycoon with a Midas touch. It was an incredibly entertaining season, and John Candy was massively important to it. When the Argos went on the road, they drew big crowds, and yes, it was to see the Rocket, and it was to see Matt Dunnigan and Pinball Clemens, but it was also to see John Candy. And the day before the game, he's on every single radio station in town at 5 a.m. till 9 a.m. Come on out to the game tomorrow. Buy tickets. Come on, we're going to get the blackout lifted. Come on, buy tickets. He signed autograph. He bought some. I think there was a line. I don't know if the line ended up in my book, but there was lines like he bought everybody in Canada a drink that year, right? John was everywhere, and he just dominated. His presence dominated, and he not only was he just there to be to have fun and be an owner. He was the guy pushing American expansion. He was pushing hard he was the chairman of the league's expansion committee. He brought in owners to the Ottawa Rough Riders when they were bankrupt from the U.S. He did a whole lot to help save the CFL. People look at the expansion years as a failure. They only had teams in the States for 3 years, and in the end they all left. One in Birmingham, of course, Scott, and was it a failure? Yeah, maybe it was a failure in the sense that it didn't take root and last. But it bought the CFL time. It bought them some money, and it bought them some time when they needed it desperately. And so you could argue that John Candy and Bruce McNall, less Wayne, because Wayne wasn't really involved in the operation so much, but those two guys, by pushing for U.S. expansion, they did end up having the league survive even after they were gone. But John's a huge part of the story. The book's called Year of the Rocket. John Candy, Wayne Gretzky, a crooked tycoon, and the craziest year in football history. And I think it's an accurate title. It really was the craziest year in football history in many ways. I mean, some of the stuff that happened that year with the Argos and the Grey Cup and the Rocket, I mean, they paid him more money than any player would ever been paid in football. He was making more money than Joe Montana and Jerry Rice combined. It was nuts how much money they were paying him. It all adds up to an amazing story. And I spent 4 years researching it, and I hope I've done justice to it. The book will be out in a couple of months, hopefully, and people decide for themselves.
I can't wait to read it. I mean, that's just, especially it's so cool to hear that Candy was a real hands-on owner. It wasn't just something that he did kind of on a lark. I mean, that it meant something to him.
Oh yeah, talk about marketing. I mean, John was full of marketing ideas. He also came from Hollywood. He didn't think there should be a budget for this stuff, right? I mean, he insisted that Chris Columbus direct a commercial, and Chris Columbus was, he was the director of Home Alone, and he later directed the Harry Potter films, and he's a big name U.S. director, and John wanted to do a 30-second Argo spot. So Brian Cooper, the team's chief operating officer, had to like kind of tamp him down a little bit. But he did commercials. He shot commercial at the Colosseum in Rome, talking about buying Argo tickets, and the people tell him the book, and he came in with like a million marketing ideas from day one, and he wanted to bring the Blues Brothers in for opening night, and he did. He got Dan Aykroyd to come up. John Belushi, of course, was dead, but Jim Belushi came up and with Dan Aykroyd, and they flew in the real Blues Brothers band. Steve Cropper and Duck Dunn, all those amazing guys from Memphis came up and played half time and post game at the opener in '91. Made it a huge event, and that was John. That was all John's doing.
And then, of course, the end of all that, John Candy had nothing to do with how that all ended. Obviously, Bruce McNall and his eventual federal prison sentence had a lot to do with that. Him as an owner, so was he, and pardon me for not knowing this, but was he cooking the books with the Argos, or was it more robbing Peter to pay Paul? And
yeah. Robbing Peter to pay Paul is a good way of describing it. I mean, with Bruce, and he's open about this, right? He wrote a book about it. He talks openly about it. He laughs about it basically. But I mean, with Bruce, every deal was to pay for the last deal. There was all this fraud layered upon fraud. They kept snowing investors, banks, and other people to think that they had all these valuable assets that have. They did spend the money. Rocket got his money, right? For the 2 years he was up, he got his full $9 million. But they didn't make money because of that. And by year 2, they weren't paying their bills very fast, and sometimes they weren't paying their bills at all. There's a story in my book about how in 1993, when the LA Kings, which was Bruce's hockey team, when they were on the way to the Stanley Cup final that year, the equipment staff for the LA Kings phoned up to the equipment manager of the Argonauts, Danny Webb, and said, "Are you noticing anything? Because we just had a stick order rejected." And so, there was the dominoes were starting to fall and the walls were starting to collapse on McNall Sports Entertainment. And so he had the team up for sale for about almost a year. He's starting in '93. Sad story, and it's in the book, is that he insisted that Brian Cooper, who was the de facto president of the team, that he find a buyer, but don't tell Joe selling the team. And I think it was because McNall didn't want Candy to know that, like, I'm a house of cards. I don't really have all the money you thought I had. In retrospect, what if Candy had known? Would he have had time to maybe put together a group to buy the team and let him continue with his love of the Argos? Maybe, although that might not have been the best. In fact, it wouldn't have been the best thing for John and his family, because he would have run out of money eventually. It came to a sad end. And of course, he just found out that they'd sold the team. He finally found out. He found out it was for sale. He toyed with the idea of putting together his own group, and then came to the realization fairly quickly that he couldn't pull it together, or maybe that he shouldn't pull it together for the sake of his own financial fortunes. And then he dropped dead in Mexico. Like, it just all happened together. And then 2 years later, McNall's in jail for 6 years. And we've all moved on and sort of forgotten, but it was the most crazy year in the history of the Argonauts. And the way it came to an end the following year is pretty interesting too. There's a pretty part of the book is about '92 and the way it all fell apart. And Rockets, didn't want to be here. And in a game against the Calgary Stampeders, he stomped on a guy's head. There's all kinds of stories like that, right? So.
Wow. And when you were working on the book, were you able to interview John Candy's family and Rocket?
Yep. Yeah, not Rocket. I tried for 14 months to get Rocket to talk to me. Never got an answer. I tried everything you could try. Phone calls, emails, texts. I sent a registered letter to his house. I went through several people that are good friends of his to ask him. Got nothing. Finally, I got an intermediary. I said to this person, if he's not going to do it, get him to at least tell me. And finally, in the end, he declined. So he's the one guy that I wasn't able to talk to that I wish I had been able to. A few people, of course, died along the way. I mean, I never got a chance to talk to Darrell K. Smith, one of the greatest receivers in Argo history. a very colorful character, but he died before I started working on the book. But yeah, I talked to Jennifer and Christopher Candy. They have really fond memories of the Argos and their time going to games. And their mother, Rose, John's widow, Rose Candy, every year they'd have up at the family farm north of Toronto, they'd have the Rose Bowl, and they'd all wear Argo jerseys and play a game of football. John would be playing rushing the passer, counting steamboats and stuff like that. So.
And were you able to interview Gretzky?
Yeah. Talked to Gretzky. He had some very interesting things to say. Told me some things I'd never heard before. I didn't get a super long interview with Wayne, but I got enough time to get some very, very useful information about Rocket, about Candy, about the organization as a whole. Gretzky, of course, is one of the few guys that got his name on both the Stanley Cup and the Grey Cup. And that meant a lot to him at the time, but he also he realized certainly sooner than John did, and maybe even sooner than Bruce did, this isn't going to work financially. He wanted out by year 2, and he got dragged along for the full three plus years, but he was not happy about losing money. Although he told me he didn't lose any money, but maybe he didn't, because people very close to Bruce told me, well, that was the way with Bruce. He never wanted his partners or his friends. So if you lost money over here, he'd cut you in on a deal over here where you'd make money. So it's possible Wayne got back his investment through race horses or other investments that Bruce and he did together.
Yeah. And were you able to interview Bruce?
Oh yeah. I had a good interview with Bruce. I went and interviewed him in his office down in Santa Monica. I mean, it's how the mighty have fallen, right? I mean, there's a great story in the book about how when Larry Smith became the commissioner of the CFL in '92, and the first time he went down to LA to meet with McNall, he had like 4 floors of his office tower, and then 6 months later he had 2 floors, and 6 months after that he had 3 people or something. And when I interviewed Bruce, it was in a nondescript office. It looks like he was basically renting a small office in a suite of offices. He didn't even have a real proper desk. He's still got friends, and he still gets to go to LA Kings games for free and all that stuff. But he's not the player that he used to be. But he knows it, and he talks about it basically. He doesn't really apologize for all the things he did. He just kind of sheepishly, with a grin, acknowledges that he did it. He does say, that owning the Argonauts was one of the most fun things he ever did in his life. And a big part of what made it so much fun was working with John Candy.
In a way, and if I'm hearing it correctly, man, correct me if I'm wrong or if you think different, but in a way, McNall kind of saved the CFL by bringing in Candy, by bringing in Gretzky, talking expansion. Do you think we would be talking about CFL football at this point without McNall, without Gretzky, without John Candy?
You're onto something, Greg. I mean, it's very possible we wouldn't be. I mean, the league was in really rough strait back then. It's funny, when I talk about '91 as the greatest year, the craziest, most magical, electrifying year in the 150 years of Argonauts football, and it was all of that. And people remember, oh yeah, the Rocket and Candy and Gretzky, they all remember the Blues Brothers. Everybody has all these happy memories, and they're true. They're all real. But at the same time, the Argos opened the '91 season in Ottawa against the Rough Riders. 4 weeks later, the Ottawa Rough Riders declared bankruptcy, right? And Calgary didn't have an owner for much of that season, and Hamilton was on the brink. Teams were struggling, and so having McNall and Candy and Gretzky and Rocket and Pinball and Dunnigan and all those guys, it definitely helped the league then. And then it did, as I said earlier, it led to expansion, which whether it's a failure or not because it didn't survive, it brought in some money when they needed it. Arguably the league's lowest point was in '96, which was at the first year after the expansion era was over. Baltimore had folded and moved up to Montreal. Everybody else left. And the league was very entertaining that year. The Argos were lucky to get Doug Flutie, and we had a great year and won the Grey Cup. But to get to the Grey Cup in Hamilton that year, and the league was out of money. They didn't have enough money to give the players in the Grey Cup their game checks. They had to go to a sponsor, Tim Hortons, and get money so they could pay the players for playing in the Grey Cup. So if they were that close to dying 5 years after McNall got there, would they've even got there without McNall? It's a great question. We'll never know the answer, but I think it's very possible the league might have died by '93 had it not been for McNall, Gretzky, and Candy and that whole circus.
Wow. This has been a great hour talking. and this is a great story. I mean, and this is one after I know both Scott and I want to really pick this conversation up after your book comes out to talk more about the Argos. If you could, can you let everybody know where they can find you and how to order your
Sure.
not only your first book, but your second book? And I'm speaking from I read your book and your first book about the Argos, and it's one of my favorites. So
Well, thank
I do
you much. I
appreciate you
appreciate
for
that.
writing it, because
Yeah.
I always love good writing, and much like Scott, you're a great writer, and we're both looking really forward to your new book coming out.
Yeah, I'm ordering this one immediately as soon as you tell us how to do it.
well, thank you both for kind words. I really did. I really enjoyed writing that first book, and I believe that it's a part of Canadian history that deserves to be preserved. And the Argos have been an institution in this country for almost 150 years, and that's only a little slice. The 81 to 83 era is only 3 years out of that whole time. But it's an important part of the history. I'm glad I was able to reach out to so many people to tell me about their own perspectives, and so I could try to capture it in the book. And I feel the same way about the 91 era, that, the Hollywood era, that you could call it, I guess, that it really deserves to be preserved, so that 100 years from now, somebody could go back and read that and go, wow, that happened. So in terms of how to get it, now I can't give you ordering information quite yet. I do have a publisher. I'm happy to tell you. The publisher is named Sutherland House. It's a Toronto-based nonfiction company with a great editor, a guy named Kenneth White, who's one of Canada's greatest editors. And the plan is for the book to be out and for sale on both sides of the border by around the time the league starts the season this year. So it could be out as early August, or it might be more like around Labor Day, around early September. If the season goes ahead, there's a possibility that the Argos will be honoring the 91 team with a of some sort, because it's their 30th anniversary. Right. So obviously the publisher, Kenneth, really wants to sort of peg the sales of the book to that if possible. So it'll be out. You just sort of stay tuned as far as that goes. It will be available everywhere. It'll be available on Amazon. You'll be able to order it directly from you'll be able to bookstores in Canada. How much penetration will get into the US market in the stores? I don't know. I would guess it might be in pockets, maybe in the LA area because of Candy and Gretzky and McNall, maybe around Chicago because of Rocket being from Notre Dame. Who knows? That's not my problem. They'll figure out distribution. To get in touch with me, though, I mean, maybe the fastest way is through Twitter. I'm at PXW13. My Gmail address is paulwoods13@gmail.com. I can sell people directly copies of the first book, Bouncing Back. I self-published that, and I've got copies on hand here. You can also order it online. Speaking sort of selfishly, if you decide to order it online, I prefer you order it through Lulu. LULU.com, which is the people that actually printed the book for me, because I get a bigger take of the sale price if you buy it through them than I do through Amazon. Amazon takes a big cut, but either way, I wanted to find an audience, and if anybody wants the book can find it however they find it, I'd love people to pick it up and read it. I enjoyed writing it. What inspired me was I'd left my job at Canadian Press after 30 plus years, and I was still a pretty young guy in my 50s. I thought, I want to do something else. I got life left of me. And one day I was out riding my bike, and I thought, I've always loved the 83 Argos, and I've always wanted to read a book about them, and I don't think anybody's ever going to write one, so I'm going to. And luckily, having journalism skills, I was able to sort of know how to interview and know how to track people down, and so I did it. And it was incredibly well received by readers, by fans, by members of the team back then. And I hope my 91 book is even better. I'm really proud of it. I think it's a great story. Took a lot more work than the 81 to 83 one took. Some of that was self-imposed. I interviewed more people, but I also think the story is way bigger and richer and more complex. So yeah, it'll be out probably, it's June 5th. It'll be out, hopefully out in 2 months, or certainly it'll be out by 3 months now. And I'll be putting the word out on social media, and I'll make sure you guys are tagged and you can tout it. And if you want me to come back on after you've read it and talk about it, glad to do that.
Oh, we are definitely going to have you back on after it comes out. So
fantastic.
Well, Paul, thank you very much for coming on and speaking for Scott and I, and and everybody down here in the States. Hopefully we get quite a few people listening to this podcast, and we're in our 3rd episode, and we really want to thank you for coming on. This has been a great hour, and I know you have places to be. We could easily go on for another hour hearing stories about the Argos. So, yeah. But yeah, we will definitely have you back on. So with that said, this is Greg James with Scott Adamson, and thank you for coming and listening to us from the 55-yard line. And as always, football unites. Thank you very much, Paul. See you soon.
Thank you so much, guys. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.
Fight the foe, scoring touchdowns for the blue on blue. The Argos will win for you. Full of fight and courage, you can't stop. They pile up the points until they reach the top. Pull together till the Grey Cups won. Go Argos, go, go, go. You can't stop. They pile up the points until they reach the top. Pull together till the Grey Cups won. Go Argos, go Toronto, go. Go Argos, go, go, go.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hi, I'm Oz Davis of the True the Goats podcast here at the Sports History Network. I'd like to take a minute to tell you about quite possibly the greatest website of all time, newspapers.com. If you're listening to this podcast or any of them at the Sports History Network, you're probably into sports history. And you probably also know that for learning about anything prior to, say, 1990 online, the typical search engines like are nearly completely useless. But then there's newspapers.com. Newspapers.com gives you access to over 640 million pages worth of news from North America, Britain, Ireland, and more, dating from 1798 to last week. Do up a search for Super Bowl I, the 36th Berlin Olympics, Wayne Gretzky's first game, whatever. Newspapers.com takes you there with historical flavor that search engines like just don't give you. And now, get a free 1-week subscription to newspapers.com by visiting sportshistorynetwork.com/newspapers. With a paid subscription, you'll also be helping to support the production of this podcast and other Sports History Network shows. That's sportshistorynetwork.com/newspapers. Newspapers.com. Way better for searches than you know what I'm talking about.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.